So, everyone, welcome back to Ratio Christi, the place where we talk about difficult questions pertaining to the Christian faith. Tonight, we will be talking about an interesting argument that I don't think we've covered before, and that is the Leibnizian Cosmological Argument from Contingency. So that's a bit of a mouthful. So we've covered cosmological arguments in the past, notably the Kalam Cosmological Argument, which argues for the existence of a God from looking at the beginning of the universe. This is going to be a little different from that. So when I say argument, it's important, specifically when we're talking about arguing for the existence of God, it's important that by argument we don't mean, simply like a yelling match between two people, but rather giving reasons, logical reasons as to why something is the case, and doing so in a way that honors the Christian faith, right? And so this argument, the Leibnizian Cosmological Argument, is also known as the argument from Contingency. It originates all the way back from the 1700s with Gottfried Leibniz. He is, or was, a mathematician, a logistician, and a natural philosopher. He made quite a few advancements in the fields of calculus and philosophy and many others. And some of its modern day proponents, those who are still with us, are Doctors Alexander Proust, Dr. William Lane Craig, and Dr. Stephen T. Davies, rather. And so before we begin, it's important to cover a couple of terms, and that is the difference between necessity and contingency. And so when we say that something is contingent, what we mean is that it happens to be the case, but it doesn't need to be that way, right? And so if we say an object is contingent, and like an example of a contingent object would be something like a horse or a table, right? Or, planets, in this case, in my example, houses, right? People, things that exist, but that don't need to exist, right? There's no logical problem with them not existing. Now, on the other hand, we have what is considered necessary objects, right? And so you might be wondering, well, what has to exist, right? What's an example of a necessary object? And some mathematicians and some philosophers believe that things like numbers are necessary objects. And by numbers, I don't mean like the markings on a whiteboard, right? I mean the thing that marking on the whiteboard represents, right? Like the actual thing on the whiteboard is what we call a numeral, but this would be an actual number, right? So like even if people did not exist, right, to come up with those markings on the whiteboard, those numerals, it would still be the case that, for example, the Earth revolves around one sun, right, or one star, right? And so you'd still have that number existing even if there's no actual like numeral involved with it. And other examples of necessary objects would be, or what people consider to be necessary objects would be things like sets or functions, right? A lot of these what we call abstract objects. So I'm going to stop right there for a second and see if anyone has any questions, because it's kind of important to get that distinction down before we move on. See if I can actually pull up the chat.
Are you sharing your screen?
Yeah, is it not showing up?
Maybe it's just because the host setting.
Yeah, are you guys, okay, so that's important. Are you guys seeing the screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay.
See it. Okay, you're saying real numbers have to exist? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that's what some people believe, right? Is that that numbers are an example of things that exist necessarily, that they can't not exist.
Well, they can't.
Right. In other words, like, it's also not just something that's just a human convention or anything like that. Like they don't exist because of something else.
Okay, if you have something, rather than nothing, the numbers have to exist, and the reason they have to exist is because you have something.
Right, exactly. And there would be one of that thing, for instance, right?
Yeah,
There's only one.
Can't stand by themselves. They have to be associated with something. There's a number that has, if you say 2 + 2, it's logical, but if there's no items, then 2 plus 2 is illogical.
Right. So there wouldn't be anything for it to attach to. This is what proponents of this view would say. There wouldn't be anything for that idea of that number to attach to, but that number would still exist. It just wouldn't be instantiated.
That assumes we live in a
Now, this isn't a view
coherent-
of mine, but rather an example of some things that people consider to be necessary.
Can I give an example that I use sometimes for us during evangelism that helps?
Yeah, sure.
Is if there was nuclear fallout and there were no humans on Earth, if there are 4 cockroaches scurrying on the floor, there's still 4 bugs. Regardless if there's a human there to count them and say, oh, look, there's 4 of them. There's still 4 of them.
Exactly.
That's the argument. That's kind of like the way I always pitch it to people.
Yeah. So, but in terms of the difference between, like, understanding the conceptual difference, right, between contingency and necessity. Do you guys all understand that? Like, I don't want to get too stuck in the weeds in terms of examples of what is contingent or necessary, but rather, do you understand, like, the idea? Right? Like, so a necessary, something that exists necessarily is something that has to exist, while something that exists contingently would be something that doesn't have to exist or, you know, relies on something else for its existence.
Well,
Cool.
it's still a brain teaser, because if you have something,
Mm-hmm.
you cannot not have numbers.
Right. Yeah, in that case, yes.
So
Quantification.
say that again.
Quantification.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, numbers are used to count. Numbers are used to measure. So.
Right, and so that's why
There's no mathematics. If there's nothing, there's nothing. There's no mathematics, there's no logic, there's no nothing.
yes, assuming that nothing exists.
Well, nothing is impossible.
It is, but that's slightly outside the scope of this discussion.
No, nothing is impossible.
Let's circle back to this later. And
Right, no,
Yeah.
talk.
So, okay, so we have the basic terminology down, right? Okay.
Move forward.
So when we're talking about an argument, I also want to say, like, well, what is it that makes a good argument, right? So it's very easy to fall into this trap of thinking that when you're talking with people, you have to somehow always, like, convince them of the point you're trying to make. Otherwise, you didn't, like, do a good job arguing for it, right? But that's not necessarily the case. So in order for your argument to be a good one, first off, it has to be logically valid, right? So, like, the way that it's structured, the conclusion has to follow logically from the premises, right? And then in addition to that, all of the premises need to actually be true, right?
No, just listen
Or
to
at least
it.
not even
Call.
necessarily true, but more plausibly true than false, right? And you don't even need to fully convince someone in order for you to have made a good argument, because what it takes to convince someone is, for the most part, it varies person to person. What you're really trying to do when you're making these arguments is you're trying to raise the intellectual price tag, so to speak, of them rejecting the conclusion, right? So in order for them, for example, for the Leibnizian Cosmological Argument that we covered last semester, the first premise was that you can't get something from nothing, right? Which is a fairly intuitive premise. Like, everyone kind of knows that, but yet some people I've talked to, they will reject that premise. They'll say, no, you really can get something from nothing, right? And they'll do that just to avoid the conclusion of the argument, right? Because they know where it's leading. And in that case, I would say that, you know, we have succeeded in that argument because we've made them at least acknowledge that very high price tag, right? Does that make sense? Like, you don't necessarily need to convince them. And so with that, we're going to actually move on to the argument itself. So the form that it's sitting in is what we call a syllogism. It's very helpful to, because it acts as a roadmap for where we're going. And when you're talking with people, if you can memorize the syllogism, it will help to keep your conversation on track. and avoid any red herrings that might occur while you're trying to witness to someone. And so we're going to go through the argument right here, and then I'm going to go through each and every premise. But I first want to cover it at the high level so you guys have a overarching idea of what we're talking about. Okay, so the first premise. Every existing thing has an explanation of its existence. That explanation can be one of two types. Either in the necessity of its own nature, or else in an external explanation or cause. Right, so the second premise is if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. And I'm going to defend all of these premises, right? We're not, don't take this at face value right now. So premise 3 is the universe exists. Premise 4, therefore the universe has an explanation of its existence. And really this isn't even so much a premise as it is a conclusion from premises 1 and 3. And then finally the conclusion of the whole argument is that explanation is God. And this comes from premises 2 and 4. So I'll give you guys another a few seconds to look at this and kind of digest it, and then we will start going into it. And so while you guys are doing that, I have a couple of questions in the chat. They said, from Curtis, Forrest, can you describe what is meant by God in the argument? How is God defined in this context? So we will get to that, but for right now, you can replace God with some necessary being. And then also the same for universe. Okay, so what is the universe in this context? In this context, the universe is all of matter, all of the matter, energy, and space-time that exists. So basically the entire material world. Okay, so looking at the logical form of this argument, we can see that it is logically valid, but the question is, are the premises true? Or are they more plausibly true than false? Right, because that's what we need in order to have a good argument. And so we'll talk about the first premise. Right, every existing thing has an explanation of its existence. That explanation is one of two types, either in the necessity of its own nature, or that of an external explanation or cause. Right, and so this first premise is a version of what we call the principle of sufficient reason. And what this is basically saying is that everything that exists, right, horses, tables, houses, planets, even God, right, anything, numbers, even the things that we say exist necessarily, they must have an explanation for why they exist, right? And this is a fairly intuitive premise. It's a metaphysical principle that underlies all of science, right? Because when you think about it, science is constantly searching for explanation for things, right? And if things didn't have explanations, if they existed inexplicably, right, then science just couldn't operate, right? They would be searching in vain. And so this is saying that, everything that exists is either necessary in its being or it's contingent in its being. Another way that this premise is kind of intuitive is imagine you are, walking through the woods, right? And you find a tiny, like translucent glowing ball on the ground, right? You wouldn't walk by it and just think, oh, that just exists, like it's just there because it's there, right? And that's all, right? You would obviously think, oh no, there needs to be some reason why that thing is there, right? And so that's fairly intuitive, but let's say that the ball was now the size of a house, right? Well, that doesn't do anything to alleviate the need for an explanation. You would still need to know, why is this giant glowing ball there, right? Now let's say you blow it up to the size of a planet. Well, you would still need to say, well, why is that there? Right? And even if it gets as large as the entire known universe, you still need to ask, why is that giant glowing ball there, right? And so that is the first premise. Like, everything needs an explanation. So So I'll stop real fast after premise 1 to see if anyone has any questions.
Can you compare it to the law of causality? Is it
So,
similar?
in a sense, yes. So something having a cause is an explanation, right? So in that case, its explanation can be found in its cause. But when it comes to things, for example, that exist necessarily or exist by virtue of their own nature, then there is no cause for that, right? And so it's related to the law of causality, but it is distinct.
Yeah, this
Would that be like logic?
Can you say that again?
Would that be like logic, for example? It doesn't have like a cause and effect to it. It just exists as the nature of itself.
So some people believe that logic exists that way. Yeah. That would be, if that were true, that would be an example.
Okay, makes sense.
Yep.
JT, were you going to say something?
I was just gonna chime in and say, like, a cause is something that I guess brings something
Into being.
existence. It brings about some sort of change,
Yes.
whereas the principle of sufficient reason is more talking about there's overlap, but they are talking about different. I guess the PSR is talking about not so much change, but
Its
why
existence in the
it's
first
something
place.
Yes. Yeah. It's more of its
Okay,
existence in the
that makes
first place.
sense, yeah.
It could be talking about change, right? Some change could be the reason why something exists. But you're right. There's overlap, but they're different.
Yeah, one of the differences is that when you talk about causality, people normally talk about the need for time and that the cause precedes its effect. But with the principle of sufficient reason, there's no notion of time involved.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't enter into the equation anywhere. So, all right. So that's the first premise. So moving on from there. Premise 2. This is the one where it gets really interesting, and this is the premise that is most likely to be contested, right? Which is this idea that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, then that explanation is God, right? And so how do we get there, right? How do we show that this is true? Well, first we have to show that the universe exists contingently, right? That it doesn't need to exist, that the universe does not exist necessarily. And there are at least a few reasons for believing this. One is based in our intuition, right? So if we're going to say that the universe exists necessarily, and that the universe is basically just the sum of all of its parts to an extent, what we're basically saying is that each and every last tree and building and even subatomic particle has to exist the way that it does, which seems very counterintuitive, right? One would think that it's very, at least possible, that some random subatomic particle somewhere doesn't need to exist, right? But if we're going to say that the universe exists necessarily, right, exactly how it does, then we would have to say that each and every subatomic particle exists also necessarily. And so intuitively we think, okay, it doesn't make sense that the universe exists necessarily itself. It has to be contingent. And the second reason that we'll go over in detail is that there's scientific evidence for this. And then the third, which I'm about to go over, and then the third reason is, which I won't cover now for the purpose of time, is that there is very strong philosophical evidence. And I can go over that at the end if anyone's actually curious about it. But people tend to like the scientific evidence a bit more since we go to state and it's a very science-focused school. So this is a sub-argument that kind of defends the idea that the universe exists contingently, right? So, okay, so the first premise is that if a thing is necessary, right, then it's eternal, right? It has to have always existed. Because if we're going to say that something has to exist, that it can't fail to exist, it doesn't also make sense to say that it began to exist at some point, right? Because that would mean that before the point that it began, it didn't exist at all. And if it didn't exist at all, how can we say that it had to exist, that it couldn't fail to exist, right? And so if we can show that the universe had a beginning, that would show that the universe is not eternal, right? And if the universe is not eternal, then, and something needs to be eternal to be necessary, then the universe is not a necessary thing. But if there's only two types of things, necessary things and contingent things, right? And it's not the necessary thing, then that must mean that it's a contingent thing, right? Does that make sense? That was like a lot of words. I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page there.
I hate to ask this, but can you define what you mean by, I guess eternal means it did not have a beginning. Is that true?
Yeah, that's what I mean by eternal. I mean that it has always existed. Like if you go, no matter how far back in time you go, that thing was there. Like it has no beginning point.
And I guess something that's necessary means it is not, by definition, it is not possible for it not to have existed at any
Correct.
point.
Yes, because then it wouldn't be necessary, right? It would be, that would mean that something brought it into existence, which means it's contingent on that thing.
Makes sense.
Can you go back to the previous slide for just 1 second? 'Cause I kind of
Absolutely.
forgot what premise 2 said specifically.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a hypothetical question for you, Forrest.
Sure.
Why does a contingent thing like the universe
Mhm.
need to be explained by a necessary thing? Why can't you just have a series of contingent things explaining it?
Sure. Okay, so so you could have, for instance, a contingent cause of the universe, because we see contingent things causing other contingent things all the time, right?
Mhm.
Like you are a contingent thing, and supposedly you have parents, right? And they are contingent things, but yet they caused you,
Mhm.
as much as you wouldn't want to think about that. So the question is, why can't we just keep going back and back and back?
Mhm.
Contingent thing causing contingent thing causing contingent thing. So the reason for that is because eventually you would cause what we call a infinite regress, right? Where you would have an infinite chain of causes going backwards. And for this deals with more of the philosophical evidence, but basically it is impossible to have an infinite regress.
Okay.
And so eventually a chain of contingent explanations would need to be terminated by a necessary cause.
Yeah, I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate here. But, let's say someone said, well, why can't you just have an infinite series of contingent things?
Sure.
I can imagine it, an infinite series of contingent things. So maybe that's just the way it is.
Sure. So for reasons that are slightly outside of the scope of this,
Okay.
basically, it turns out that an actual infinite, right, cannot exist in reality. So you can have what we call a potential infinite, right? So an example of this is like if the universe were to continue on existing, or like and you could sit there and just start counting, right? Let's say you lived forever and you started counting today and never stopped, right? You would potentially count to infinity, but you would never reach an actual infinite, right? And so if you're interested in this topic of why can't an actual infinite exist, there's a great thought experiment called Hilbert's Hotel that was thought up by a German mathematician. So I would look into that a bit. So I would look into Hilbert's Hotel as well as something called the Grim Reaper paradox.
Okay.
Or if you want, I've got a quick example. If not, we can keep going.
I think we should just keep going.
No worries.
I don't want to get caught too much in the weeds.
No worries.
But I will, again, I will be free to talk after this meeting in our Discord channel if anyone, and I'll put up that information again at the end. So if anyone wants to sit and chat there about, the Grim Reaper paradox or Hilbert's Hotel or anything like that, we can talk then. Okay, so if we can show that the universe had a beginning, that would show that it is contingent, right? And then if we show that it's contingent, that means that it would eventually, its cause would eventually have to terminate in a necessary being. And so we're going to go over the scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. So in 1922, this is interesting. It won't take too long. But in 1922, Alexander Friedmann and George Lemaitre, using Einstein's theory of general relativity, they predicted that the universe was expanding. This was then later in 1929 empirically confirmed by Edwin Hubble, right? Who I'm sure all of you know about. This then led to the conclusion that the expanding universe must have sprang into existence at some point in the past, right? Or at least that's what they predicted. This prediction was then empirically confirmed in 1965 when what is called the cosmic microwave background radiation was discovered. This was discovered by two radio astronomers, Robert Wilson and Arno Penzias, which you can see them on the bottom right. And this discovery confirmed the existence of a finite universe. And so the final nail in the coffin was actually a theorem that was written in 2003 called the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. And this, when this theorem was presented, it demonstrated that any universe that was on average expanding in its past could not be past eternal, right? And Alexander Vilenkin, when he's talking about this, he says, it is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning, right? And so this is very quickly just some of the scientific evidence, right? And all of this is what we kind of know as know more colloquially as the Big Bang, right? And so we know that since the universe had a beginning, it has to be contingent, right? And so therefore it needs an explanation outside of itself, right? But what would this explanation be like, right? And this is now where we get into the God part of it, right? So we know it has some external explanation, but what is that explanation like? Well, since the universe is all of physical reality, we know that whatever caused it must be non-physical, right? Because if the universe is all of physical reality, it obviously can't be something physical that brought it to begin to exist, right? It also has to be outside of space-time because the universe is all of space-time. It has to be extremely powerful, or at least contain a fair amount of potential energy to be able to cause the universe to begin. And then this is the interesting part that throws a lot of people off, is that it has to be a mind. Now this is something that that isn't quite as intuitive. But before I get to describing the mind part, does anyone have any questions, clarifying questions that, things that don't make sense to them? And then here's the previous slide. I guess that's not very helpful, is it?
So in sort of Christianese speak, non-physical would mean spirit. Outside of space and time would be eternity. So this explanation would be outside eternity. Extremely powerful would mean it's omnipotent, because and a mind would mean it's personal. Is that how I would interpret this?
Yes, yeah. If you had to translate that into what you called Christian speak, then yeah,
Okay,
those would be the corresponding attributes.
thank you.
And Curtis asked, why is it physicists never smile? Probably because they have to do so much math. I wouldn't smile either. Cool. So we all good on that so far? Okay, so the big question, why does it have to be a mind, right? So by mind, I don't mean brain, right? I obviously, if I'm going to say that the cause has to be non-physical, I'm not going to go ahead and then say in the next breath that it has to be this physical thing that we call a brain. By a mind, I mean something like Curtis said that's personal, that is endowed with a freedom of the will, right? Or its own volition, the ability to choose. And so the reason that it's a mind is kind of motivated by the question of how can we get a contingent reality, right, the universe, from a necessarily existing being, right? Unless that being is a personal agent endowed with freedom of the will. Because when you think about it, if whatever caused the universe is just a set of necessary and sufficient conditions, right? Much by necessary and sufficient, I mean, let's say I'm like holding this pen, right? My releasing it is necessary for it to fall, right? But it's also sufficient for it to fall in that there's nothing else that's needed, right? And so I let go and down it goes. The instant that that necessary and sufficient condition is met, the effect occurs, right? Simultaneously with the cause. So if the cause of the universe is just an eternal set of necessary and sufficient conditions, we would also expect that the effect, the universe itself, would be eternal, right? Because if an infinite amount of time ago, those conditions were met, which they would have been, then we would expect that the universe has existed for an infinite amount of time. But given the scientific evidence that we just looked at, we know it didn't. We know that it did begin. And so how do you explain how you get this contingent, non-eternal effect from a necessary cause? And the only way that anyone has ever thought of that this can actually occur is if you have a mind, right, that exists eternally, that chooses when to create. Right? That's the only way you can really get there. And so other people have said, well, what else meets this criteria of being, non-physical outside of space and time? And that would be things that we call abstract objects, right? That also meets that criteria. Abstract objects being like numbers and functions and sets, those kind of things. But part of the definition of what it means to be an abstract object is that it doesn't stand in causal relations with anything, right? That it can't cause anything. That's part of the definition of what it means to be abstract. And so that rules that out. And so all we're left with is a mind, right? And let's say someone doesn't buy the reasoning there, which I think is pretty airtight, at least until someone comes up with another alternative, which they haven't. You're still, or whoever you're giving this argument to, is still stuck with a explanation of the universe that is non-physical, outside of space and time, and extremely powerful, right? And that's something far beyond what anything in naturalism can describe, right? It's far beyond anything within the atheist's worldview, right? So they would at least have to change their view on some things. Okay, so where are we now? The universe has an explanation for its existence. And the explanation is not the universe itself, it's something outside of it. And that thing outside of it is a non-physical, extremely powerful mind, right? And this is what the Christian means when they say God, right? So the second premise, if the universe has an explanation for its existence, the explanation is God. Premise 3, the universe exists. This is something that's obvious to any sincere seeker of truth. If someone denies this, then you're wasting your time talking to them. You should probably just move on, because they're not going to listen to anything else you say. They have reduced themselves to absurdity, basically, and are willing to accept anything other than the conclusion that you're trying to bring them to.
I find your judgment very presumptuous, Forrest.
Yeah.
I feel personally offended by your remarks. Just wanna put that out there.
I'm sure you do.
Weren't we gonna mute him?
Yeah, we were going to. What happened to that, Curtis? I guess Will's the host. All right, so yeah, that's premise 3. And everything's pretty straightforward from here. Premise 4 just logically follows from premises 1 and 3. First premise being that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, and that the universe exists, so therefore the universe has an explanation of its existence. And premise 5, which is the conclusion, says if the universe has an explanation for its existence, the explanation is God. When you pair that with the universe having an explanation of its existence, you get the conclusion that the explanation of the universe is God. And that's it. That is the Leibnizian Cosmological Argument, also known as the argument from Contingency. And so these are some additional resources that if you guys are more interested in diving a little deeper than 40 minutes of presentation can give. The first one is a link to William Lane Craig's website, specifically a talk that he gives on this argument. The second one is a 12-minute video by a guy named Inspiring Philosophy, or at least that's what his YouTube channel is called. He's a super great guy. I've met him in real life at a Ratio Christi conference, actually. So he's super smart. And then the third one, if you really, really want to go deeply into it, there is Blackwell's Companion to Natural Theology. It is basically it's a textbook. And so there's 100 pages dedicated to it, to this argument, by Alexander Proust. He's the one that writes the article for it. So, Gianni wants to know what are some standard pushbacks or objections to this argument. I do have some of those written out. Before we get to there, is there anyone that has any questions about any particular premise of the argument that, maybe isn't buying it, or something just doesn't make sense, like I've completely lost you somewhere along the way, right? I can go back and explain things differently. Like I said, this is something we haven't covered before. It's a philosophically deep and rich argument. It would not surprise me if someone didn't understand it, especially after just a 40-minute talk, right? So.
I had a question earlier that was in the chat.
Oh. My bad. If the universe exists necessarily, would that mean that everything in it would too? Couldn't you disprove that by proving any part isn't necessary? So I'll answer the first part first. I'm not sure I fully understand the second question. But if the universe exists necessarily, wouldn't that mean everything in it would too? So the universe, as we've defined it, is all of space-time and all material things, right? And so if you had a completely different set of material things, then what you'd end up with is a different universe, right? It wouldn't be the universe we're talking about now. But what we're saying is that the universe, or what someone would try to defend, is that the universe we're talking about now, like this, our actual universe, exists necessarily, right? And so all you would have to do is show that it could be different, right? And that would show that it doesn't exist necessarily. It exists contingently because it could have been different. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question?
Kind of.
Kind of? What do you mean, kind of?
Well, I wasn't asking like how to prove that it doesn't exist necessarily. I'm saying if it did exist necessarily, would that mean everything in it would also exist necessarily? Like every piece of it.
Yes. Right. And that's the case because if any part of it were different, then it like wouldn't actually exist necessarily. Like it existing necessarily entails that it exists exactly how it is and that it actually could not have been different. And you guys are quiet. I literally hear crickets outside.
I have a question.
right.
So this argument really just proves that there is a deity, but it doesn't necessarily prove that there is a personal what we would call in this club a Christian God, like right, like or what the Bible actually lays out, like God's nature. It doesn't necessarily describe that, but just that there is some sort of creator.
Right. So this is an argument from the school of what we call natural theology. So it's, observing nature and deriving theological conclusions from that. And so this argument will get you some of the properties of the Christian God, right? So it's much like the Kalam cosmological argument in that sense. But it doesn't get you all of them, right? For example, this argument doesn't get you that God is like morally perfect or anything like that, right? What you do get is you get that it's extremely powerful. You get God's, basically like omnipresence or like his timelessness and spacelessness. You get that he's immaterial, and you get that it's a mind, right? And those are all attributes of the Christian God, and attributes of things that just simply don't exist in a naturalistic worldview. But no, it doesn't get you, this doesn't get you to Christianity, but it would get you to some general form of theism.
Right. Cool.
Yep. Which is a good first step.
I've only, I think I've only ever heard William Lane Craig try to bridge that gap from like the Kalam or any sort of argument like this. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone else do it. Do you know anyone?
I have.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so if you're looking for arguments to bridge that gap, we can definitely talk about that. Some that I would suggest are, you would want to first look at the historical evidence surrounding the personhood of Jesus. And I think that will get you there, right? Because once you have the existence of a God, right, you have to then say, well, if God exists, then miracles are possible, right? And then that opens you up to be able to see those kind of miracles throughout history. And you can then examine the historical evidence and all of the documentation surrounding who Jesus is, and that, I think that will get you to Christian theism. But this argument by itself won't.
Right.
Yep. All right.
Just a quick comment or note, I guess. There is a invite link in the chat that I just sent. So for the Discord, sorry.
Right. Yeah. So Discord is a great place for us to all like kind of meet up and chat and plan events and have like post-talk discussions. So if you guys aren't in it yet, it's open to anyone. So you're more than welcome to join. And if you're not familiar with Discord, it's kind of like, I would say kind of like Slack, or it's a much better version of GroupMe. It's like it's actually a computer app. So yeah.
Hey, I have a question on this slide. I guess I'm trying to understand what's the difference between 5 and 2, number 2 and 5. I guess I'm seeing that number 2 just says if.
Yeah.
That's the only difference.
So logically speaking, number 2 is what we call a conditional statement. It says if X, then Y, right? So like if it's raining outside, then I will bring an umbrella, right? While number 5 is just like a conclusion, right? It's saying that's the I will bring an umbrella part of it. So it's like if it's raining outside, I'll bring an umbrella. then it is raining outside, and so therefore I will bring an umbrella. Right? And so it's saying, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, then that explanation is God. And then number 4 says, well, the universe does have an explanation for its existence, from which it logically follows from those two premises that the explanation is God. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yes, that makes sense. And
So it's
3, I would say, is a assumption.
Yeah,
Or
well, 3 is just a premise. It's just a statement of fact.
you don't need to, even have something before that. It's just clear.
Right, yeah. And I mean, like number 1 and 2 are premises as well that you would have to defend. And ordinarily you do have to defend your premises, but the evidence for number 3 is so extreme that it's not really even worth taking the time to sit here and defend, right? Because it's obvious to anyone that's being truthful that, hey, the universe exists, right? Like, you exist, you're in the universe. That's just how the state of affairs are, you know?
Hey, Forrest, can you go back to the slide about premise 1?
Right here?
Yeah. Is that the only slide for premise 1?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering, because I think a lot of, it should be obvious that premise 1 is real, but I think what often happens in discussions is people will say, oh, well, how do you know? There's an explanation for everything. Maybe there just isn't. So do you have any recommendations for dealing with that sort of response?
Sure. I would say that it's worse than magic, right? Because if they're saying that something can just exist without any explanation whatsoever, right? That's very similar to the claim that something can come from nothing, right? Which is worse than magic, right? Because at least in magic, when a magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat, you have the rabbit, you have the hat, and you have the magician, right? But what they're saying is much worse than that. They're saying that, no, you can pull the rabbit out of thin air, right? Which is absurd.
I like that phrase, worse than magic. It's short and concise, and I think most people will understand what that means. So,
yep,
less abstract.
I think it's worth discussing if you bring up all of the entire argument. One of the things, JT, that you probably are just sort of zeroing in on is that for the scientists to deny this argument, it's really challenging, because what you are doing if you deny this argument is you are undercutting science, the thing you do every day at 1 or 3. And so when Forrest pointed out, we can't force somebody to agree to something, but we can make them pay a high intellectual price.
Right.
For the scientists, you're forcing them to deny their profession by not agreeing with this argument. So that's pretty high.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? If not, I'll move on to some common pushbacks, as Gianni put it. Okay, cool. So some people will say, well, this is usually the first one, right? They'll say, okay, well, what about, like, the universe needs an explanation, but what about God, right? Doesn't he have an explanation, right? You're kind of excluding him from the first premise, right? To which we would say, well, no, we're not, because what the first premise says is every existing thing, of which God is one of those things, so we claim, has an explanation of its existence. That explanation can be one of 2 types, either in the necessity of its own nature, or else in an external explanation or cause. We would say that God is that first type, that he exists due to a necessity of his own nature, right? And so then they'll say, okay, well, why does God exist necessarily, right? And this is part of in order to fully understand that, you'd have to fully understand what we mean by God, in that we're talking about a maximally great being, right? And this ties into what we call the ontological argument, which is a different argument for the existence of God that's a lot more philosophically complex than this. But basically, a maximally great being, right? One that has all of the all of the properties that make something maximally great. One of those properties is existing necessarily, right? Because a being that could not exist, right, is a much lesser being than a being that has to exist. And so another pushback would be, why not just why does it have to be a necessarily existing being? Why can't it be some other kind of necessarily existing substance, right? Like, why does it have to be a necessarily existing being like God? And to which you would say, you would go back and you would revisit there it is. You would revisit what the explanation for the existence of the universe would be like, right? And you could say, okay, let's assume it's a substance. Well, whatever this substance is non-physical, it's outside of space and time, it's extremely powerful, and we have good reason to believe it has to be a mind. But that explanation sounds just like the one that the theist is offering, right, which is God, right? And so there's really no difference between those. Let's see, another pushback is, okay, well, what if the universe is the one thing that doesn't have an explanation? What if it just created itself, right? Like, what if this first premise, the principle of sufficient reason, applies to everything but the universe? To which we would say, well, that's just special pleading, right? That's what we call the taxi cab fallacy, right? Which is, it's like the principle of sufficient reason is just this cab that you've taken to whatever destination you want to get to. So you've used it however you wanted, and then you just discard it once you get there, right? But we can't just do that with logical statements or like metaphysical principles like this, right? If they apply to one thing, they apply to everything. And so this form of special pleading doesn't really help that much. And then the last most common one would be, okay, well, what about like a multiverse, right? What if our universe is just part of a larger multiverse? Well, there's a few problems with that. One, that kind of just pushes the problem back a step, right? Because then we would still need an explanation for why the multiverse exists, right? Because that falls right back under the principle of sufficient reason, which is every existing thing has an explanation of its existence. And so we would say, okay, well, does the multiverse exist necessarily? And the answer would again have to be no, for the exact same scientific reasons why the universe does not exist necessarily. In that, in this case, the Borguth-Bellingcat theorem, right? It turns out that applies to multiverses as well, right? And so it shows that even multiverses that are expanding on average have a need to find them a actual beginning, right? And if they find a beginning, that means they're not eternal. And if they're not eternal, then they're not necessary. And if they're not necessary, that must mean they're contingent, right? Which means they need an explanation. And so really that objection falls through as well. Is that enough for you, Gianni?
Yeah, makes sense.
Cool. And I'm sure you could find some other ones. I'm sure a lot of them would be very similar to this, to these. But once you actually properly understand this argument, those objections tend to fall away. Usually the objections are, they either don't attack one of the original premises shown here, or they just completely misunderstand them. Cool, and that's all I have for you guys.